Smoke rises over the skyline of Dar es Salaam. The air is thick, not with celebration, but with fear. It was supposed to be a day of democracy, a day when every Tanzanian voice would count. Instead, the morning of October 30th, 2025 became a battlefield. Gunfire echoed through the narrow streets. Mothers hid their children. Students tore down campaign posters that had long promised progress. And for the first time in decades, ordinary Tanzanians, teachers, shopkeepers, fishermen shouted in one united voice, "We will no longer be silenced." Across the country from Mwanza to Dodoma, crowds surged into the open defying curfews and police lines. They were not asking for luxury. They were asking for truth, the right to vote, to speak, to live without fear. But when two of President Samia Suluhu Hassan's main rivals were barred from the race and the ruling party declared victory before the votes were even counted, the illusion shattered. This was not an election. It was an awakening. A nation's patience had run dry. What happens when democracy becomes a cage, when freedom turns into silence? Can a government still claim legitimacy when its people are bleeding in the streets? And more importantly, can Africa ever rebuild its moral compass when those meant to lead choose control over compassion? Tonight, we travel into the heart of Tanzania, into its streets of fire and its cries for dignity, to understand how a country once called an island of peace has become a symbol of resistance. If you believe that truth still matters more than headlines, stay with us. If you believe that democracy should serve people, not power, subscribe, share, and let your voice be part of Africa's awakening. The story begins not with an explosion, but with silence. For months before Election Day, the signs were there. Opposition rallies canceled, journalists detained, new restrictions placed on the internet. Yet Tanzanians, proud and patient, still lined up to vote on October 30th, 2025, believing their voice could still make a difference. But by noon, whispers began spreading through Dar es Salaam. Two major opposition candidates, Tandulu, a fiery reformist imprisoned since April on treason charges, and Luhagamina of ACT Wazalendo had been officially disqualified. The message was clear. The ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, the party of the revolution, was running unopposed. By evening, the illusion collapsed. Crowds gathered in city centers chanting "Haki kwa wote," justice for all. They had been told to stay home. Instead, they filled the streets. In Dar es Salaam, the sun set over barricades made of tires and broken concrete. Smoke rose as protesters, many of them young and barefoot, faced off with heavily armed police. They told us we were free. One man shouted into a camera before the footage cut off, "But free people don't get shot for voting." In Mwanza, on the shores of Lake Victoria, something remarkable happened. Hundreds of citizens stormed a gas station owned by a politician loyal to the president. They carried away blue gas cylinders, both full and empty. To outsiders, it might have looked like looting, but to Tanzanians, it was symbolic, a reclaiming of survival itself. "These are our taxes," a woman screamed as she lifted a cylinder onto her back. "We paid for this, now we take it back." Elsewhere in Dodoma, young people lit candles on the steps of government buildings, holding up signs that read, "One vote, one truth." But the police arrived before dawn. Tear gas filled the air, followed by live rounds. At least 17 people were confirmed dead in the first hours, though local doctors say the number could be twice as high. By morning, Tanzania's cities were unrecognizable. Curfews were declared. Soldiers were deployed. Roads were blocked. The government called it a necessary operation to restore order. The people called it proof of fear. Amid the chaos, something else unfolded, a quiet digital rebellion. As internet access was shut down across the nation, Tanzanians found another way to connect. Using a walkie-talkie app called Zello, they created underground communication networks. Messages passed from one town to another, guiding people towards safe zones and away from military checkpoints. In one of those voice messages, a trembling young woman can be heard saying, "If you can hear this, please stay inside. They are shooting in Mwanza. But don't be afraid. We are together." Through this invisible web of voices, citizens kept their movement alive. The blackout could stop the internet, but it could not stop solidarity. As dawn broke on the second day, the world began to notice. Images leaked through VPNs and satellite phones showed hospitals overflowing with the wounded smoke drifting across highways and military trucks patrolling ghostly streets. Businesses shuttered their doors. Schools closed indefinitely. Still, the people refused to disappear. One protester, his face covered in dust and sweat, looked into a reporter's camera and said softly, "We have nothing left to lose except the silence they want us to keep." That silence, the one that kept generations obedient, was now broken. What began as a protest over a rigged election had become something far greater, a fight for the soul of Tanzania. By the third night, Tanzania was no longer holding its breath. The silence had turned into thunder. From the city centers of Dar es Salaam to the quiet lakeside of Mwanza, the country pulsed with one rhythm: defiance. When soldiers arrived at midnight, they expected fear. Instead, they found courage. Citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, holding nothing but banners and faith. Some carried kitchen pans, others only flags. They sang the national anthem through clouds of tear gas, their voices breaking but unyielding. Tanzania. Tanzania. Nakupenda kwa moyo wote. Tanzania. I love you with all my heart. Then came the gunfire. Not warning shots, but bullets fired into the air and soon after into the crowds. Streets once alive with music turned into corridors of screams. Hospitals overflowed. Families searched through the smoke for missing sons and daughters. By dawn, at least 30 people were dead, perhaps many more. But something unexpected happened. The people didn't retreat. They gathered again, this time in silence. Entire neighborhoods stood still, arms raised high, refusing to move. That silence, raw, heavy, defiant, became a new kind of protest. In the midst of the chaos, videos began circulating through encrypted networks. One showed an elderly man standing in front of a tank whispering, "Shoot me if you must, but you cannot shoot my country." Another, filmed secretly from a balcony, captured soldiers lowering their rifles, a few even joining the marchers. This was the breaking point. For the first time, cracks appeared within the system meant to control them. But President Samia Suluhu Hassan's government called the protesters criminals. Her interior minister labeled them foreign-backed agents. And General Jacob Makanda, the army chief, went on national television, "We will not allow disorder. Property must be protected. Those who destroy peace are enemies of the state." As he spoke, gunfire echoed in the distance, a haunting contradiction the whole world could hear. Across the border in Kenya's town of Namanga, frightened residents reported Tanzanian police firing tear gas canisters that drifted across into Kenyan territory. Local reports said at least 2 Kenyans died in the chaos. The violence had spilled beyond borders. The international reaction came swiftly. The European Union declared the election neither free nor fair, citing intimidation, media censorship, and manipulation of institutions. Amnesty International condemned the deeply disturbing deaths of civilians and demanded an independent investigation. The U.S. Embassy issued an alert urging Americans to avoid Tanzania's major cities, warning of unpredictable and potentially deadly unrest. Even neighboring Kenya advised its citizens not to cross the border, fearing escalation. Meanwhile, Tanzanian state television showed only images of calm streets, sanitized footage filmed long before the protests began. But people knew the truth. They had seen it lived, it bled for it. And in this storm of denial, a new kind of leadership began to emerge, not from palaces, but from the people themselves. Youth volunteers organized secret first aid posts in mosques and churches. Taxi drivers turned their vehicles into ambulances. Women distributed bread and bottled water to those on the front lines. An unarmed revolution had taken shape. And it was not led by politicians, it was led by ordinary people who had lost everything but their courage. As one young protester whispered to a journalist before being taken away by soldiers, "They can shut down the internet, but they can't shut down our hearts." By then, the fight had already gone beyond the ballot box. It had become a test of endurance between power and the people, between silence and survival. And as the fires burned through the Tanzanian night, the world finally began to watch and wonder how long a nation could hold its breath before history exhaled. When the smoke finally began to clear, Tanzania was left in ruins, not just the buildings, but the spirit of a nation. Hospitals overflowed, morgues filled beyond capacity. Families stood in line outside police stations, holding photos of missing sons and daughters. Many would never return. In Dar es Salaam's Temeke district, an old woman named Rehema waited 3 days outside the city morgue before she was told her grandson's body had been buried by the state. She whispered only one sentence. He was 19. He never held a weapon, only a dream. Across Mwanza and Dodoma streets, once full of music and color, turned into gray corridors of ash. Businesses closed, schools suspended classes indefinitely. The hum of daily life, children laughing, buses honking, radios playing, disappeared. What remained was a hollow quiet, the kind that comes only after something sacred has been broken. The government declared victory. President Samia Suluhu Hassan appeared on national television calling the elections a triumph of stability and promising a return to peace. But the images of soldiers patrolling empty markets and shuttered homes told a different story. Her ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, CCM, continued to dominate every institution, the courts, the media, the electoral commission. Yet inside those walls, cracks began to form. Anonymous sources from within CCM spoke of growing unease among younger members of the military who questioned why the government had turned its guns on its own people. Behind closed doors, whispers of reform or rebellion began to spread. A few mid-ranking officers reportedly refused orders to fire on unarmed crowds. Their disobedience was quickly covered up, but it revealed a truth the government feared most, that loyalty is fragile when justice is gone. Meanwhile, Tanzania's economy bled. Tourism vanished overnight. Foreign investors froze billions in contracts. The Tanzanian shilling dropped sharply, and basic goods like rice and fuel became scarce. In some regions, the price of cooking gas, once symbolic of survival, doubled. For many families, one meal a day became the new normal. Human rights groups estimated over 500 people detained, with dozens unaccounted for. Independent journalists vanished or fled the country. The internet blackout, though partially lifted, returned sporadically each time new protests threatened to rise. And yet, despite the suffering, something profound took root. Across the nation, people began organizing in whispers, community networks, underground unions, youth-led aid groups. Churches opened their doors to shelter the wounded. Mosques offered food to the displaced. Tanzania's faith traditions, often divided by politics, rediscovered a shared humanity. For the first time in decades, citizens spoke not about fear, but about change. "We have learned," said one teacher in Dodoma, "that democracy is not just a ballot, it is the courage to say no." The events of October 30th did more than challenge an election. They exposed the fracture between a government's image and its soul. The ruling elite could claim victory on paper, but they had lost something far greater: the trust of their people. In the weeks that followed, a quiet revolution began in the villages, in classrooms, in market stalls, in whispered conversations after sunset. The question was no longer whether change was coming, it was when, and whether the government of Samia Suluhu Hassan would survive long enough to face it. While Tanzanians buried their dead, the world watched, but from a distance. In Washington, D.C., the headlines were brief: election unrest in Tanzania. No special reports, no breaking news coverage. Just another African tragedy folded neatly between segments on Wall Street and sports. To many Americans, Tanzania is still a postcard of safari planes and smiling faces, not a nation gasping under tear gas. Yet, for those who have followed Africa's quiet revolutions, this moment felt different. It was not about tribes or terror, as Western media too often frames it. It was about the meaning of democracy itself. In Europe, reactions were cautious. The European Union condemned the election as fraudulent and manipulated, but stopped short of imposing sanctions. The United Kingdom called for restraint on both sides, a phrase that angered many Tanzanians, who asked both sides, one has guns, the other has dreams. The United States State Department issued a measured statement emphasizing the importance of dialogue and stability. Stability, that familiar word, often means don't rock the boat. For decades, Western powers have chosen stability over justice in Africa, supporting regimes that guarantee contracts, not conscience. But cracks are appearing in that logic. From Sudan to Cameroon and now Tanzania, people are rejecting leaders who hide behind Western approval. And in the silence of global diplomacy, a new moral voice is beginning to rise, not from New York or Brussels, but from Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso speaks of sovereignty and justice, many across Africa listen. His message that Africa must define democracy on its own terms resonates deeply in countries like Tanzania, where people are tired of imported systems that protect power, but not people. As one Tanzanian activist said, they told us to follow the Western model, but what we got was a Western mask. For the Global South, this crisis in Tanzania is more than a national issue. It's a mirror. It asks uncomfortable questions. Why is democracy measured by elections rather than justice? Why are African voices silenced the moment they challenge global interests? In the streets of Dar es Salaam, you can still hear those questions whispered between barricades. They are not anti-American. They are profoundly human, a plea for the same principles America once fought for: liberty, representation, and truth. Meanwhile, African youth from Ghana to Kenya to Burkina Faso are drawing lessons from Tanzania's ordeal. They are watching how the world responds or doesn't, and they are realizing that the struggle for dignity may not come from outside help, but from within their own hands. The cameras may turn away, the news cycle may move on. But the people of Tanzania, much like those of Burkina Faso, have already seen the truth. And once a nation opens its eyes, it cannot be made blind again. At dawn, the streets of Dar es Salaam were quiet again. The smoke had lifted, but the scars remained on the walls, on the faces, and in the hearts of millions. The government claimed victory. But the people, though exhausted, had already won something far greater: the courage to speak. A teacher in Dodoma wrote on a chalkboard before her classroom reopened, "We have learned that silence can be fatal." Her students nodded. Outside, soldiers still guarded intersections, but for the first time, citizens met their gaze without lowering their eyes. Tanzania is standing at a threshold between fear and freedom, between illusion and awakening. The protests may fade from headlines, but the questions they raised will not. What is democracy if not accountability? What is leadership if it demands obedience instead of trust? Across Africa, those questions are echoing. From the burned streets of Mwanza to the reform halls of Ouagadougou, a new generation is drawing a line between submission and sovereignty. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré calls it the restoration of dignity. In Tanzania, people are calling it the right to be heard. Different words, but the same heartbeat. And to those watching from afar in the United States, in Europe, this moment asks for reflection too. The promise of democracy was never meant to be an export. It was meant to be a light, one that each nation must learn to kindle for itself. The question now is whether that light in Tanzania will be smothered or whether it will ignite something larger, a redefinition of freedom shaped by African hands and guarded by African hearts. Because history has a way of returning to those who ignore it, and Africa's new story is being written not in parliaments, but in the courage of its people, those who still believe that truth is more powerful than fear. So tonight, as we close this chapter, we leave you with a question: can Africa truly rise without confronting the ghosts of its false democracies? And if not, who will dare to lead that reckoning? If you believe that voices like these must be heard, share this story. If you believe that Africa's awakening has already begun, subscribe, stay informed, and keep the light alive. Because silence built the cage, but truth and courage will break it.